Welcome to Babblecom 5. This is episode 6 of season 4 of Babylon 5, Into the Fire. With less than a day to go, Ivanova and Lorien have one last first one to snag. Their appearance is timely, as Ivanova had decidedly itchy feet and had given Lorien 10 more minutes. He says that Sheridan's plan to forge a crucible from the Shadows, Vorlons and younger races is brave and very human. He says it's important for all the remaining first ones to be there, and these are the last. They are almost as old as the Vorlons, but haven't spoken to anyone outside their race for an extremely long time. He will introduce her. She asks if they'll remember him, and he smiles and says, "Oh yes, they will." Sheridan is keeping busy himself as he leads a squadron of White Stars against a Vorlon listening post. Disabling its weapons, they destroy their target to avoid ongoing detection and jump back to the main fleet in hyperspace. Thousands of ships, 24 races, working together for the first time. Sheridan tells Lanier to pour it on and take them into the fire. Lita and Marcus discuss why, when Centauri Prime is also in range of the Vorlons, they're heading to Corianus. He responds that tragically it's simple maths. 6 billion on Corianus, 3 billion on Centauri Prime. They can only be in one place. He hopes that their engagement will pull enough Vorlon ships from Centauri Prime to give them a chance. On Centauri Prime, Londo is kicking along Regent Virini to clear the royal palace of anyone who worked for Cartagia and arrange meetings with several ministers. Then Londo is going to need a word with Mr. Morden. Back in the fleet, Delenn has received confirmation from Ivanova that she sent the first ones on to the final staging area while she's returned to the station. Delenn hasn't ordered her to join the fleet, saying one more ship won't make the difference, but Sheridan is adamant that he promised her that she'd be part of the final battle, and he's not about to let her down. Lorien comes to visit Ivanova as she's nearly ready to depart. She remains sceptical about his claim to be the first ever sentient being, and he says that that's her mind talking. He asks what her heart says. She says she and her heart don't speak anymore, and he agrees, saying he'd noticed that. She decides to play the hypothetical with him, and asks how it was possible for them to live long enough to come up with a serum for immortality all in one life, although he's told her he's not immortal as she means it. It's not that his race didn't die, it's just that at first very few of them were born, and they were naturally long-lived as a result. But there came a point where the universe seemed to decide that more life and shorter lives were a better way to find out about itself, and so the balance shifted. He is the only one of the originals to remain, and has helped guide the first ones. He says that a shorter life means that Ivanova's race can revel in the belief that love is eternal, whereas his longevity means that he knows it not to be, and that may be the greatest gift humanity has been given. It's time to go. We see a Vorlon fleet in hyperspace as we flit back to Centauri Prime. Londo is visited in his quarters by an intelligence officer who had been commissioned by Cartagia to investigate Reefer's poisoning, and by extension the poisoning of Londo's love Ladira. Londo had always believed her death was retaliation from Reefer, given that the poison used was Centauri and she came from Centauri Prime. The intelligence officer confirms this was the case, but the dealer sold the poison to an agent of Mr. Morden, not of Reefer. His efficient conclusion being that Mr. Morden was looking to use the Reefer situation to his own advantage by making Londo turn to him for support once more, which of course he did. Londo slumped into a chair, dismissing the intelligence officer curtly, before beginning a grief and anger-stricken rampage around the room, decrying the simple reality that Morden played him like a puppet. Ivanova's feet remain itchy as she urges the Minbari crew to maximum speed. Only hell means continuous fire in Minbari, as Lorien notes when she wonders why she's firing at hyperspace for no apparent reason. He says that patience can also be a weapon. He believes that Sheridan knows what he will have to understand in order to gain victory. It just remains to be seen if he knows that he knows. Ivanova exchanges looks with him as they continue. At Corianus 6, the fleet is assembled, but Sheridan says they can't win. Marcus is puzzled as to what they're doing there if that's the case, to which Sheridan responds honestly he's hoping the truth will set them free. Marcus confirms asteroids have been mined with nukes, yes, again, and Sheridan asks Lita to remain open to anything she can pick up when the big players arrive, as she's made contact with the shadows before. On Centauri Prime, Londo's preparations are complete, and Mr. Morden, fully healed, is brought before him. There follows a terrific exchange between the pair, where Londo demands that the shadow vessels leave, whilst Morden reiterates that the Vorlons won't kill 3 billion to get the ships. Londo then decides his associates are afraid, and speaking of whom, Morden's guards pull back, and Londo tells him to stay quite still, as guards flanking Londo with heavy-duty rapid-fire blasters blaze away at thin air on either side of Morden. At least one of his shadow companions drops. Nice intel on Londo's part. Londo gives Morden one more chance, and in a nice bit of foreshadowing, Londo agrees with Morden that their ships are impressive in air or space, but right now they're on the ground, and they can sense an approaching ship. Morden asks him what he's going to do, blow up the island? And Londo turns away from him, takes something from his pocket, turns back, and says, "Now that Mr. Morden mentions it," click, boom! Morden screams as 3 nukes go off on the island of Selene. Big ones. A lesson from the Sheridan playbook. Morden is physically shaken and mentally seems to crumble. He is taken away, shouting about allies that will make the Centauri pay for what Londo has done. Londo says he's nowhere near finished with Morden just yet. Ivanova had made it to Coriolis just in time, and Lorien transfers to Sheridan's ship just as the Shadows and Vorlons come into the system, to be met by Sheridan's wake-up call of nukes on rocks. Lita confirms that this has successfully got their attention in no uncertain terms, as both fleets turn away from each other and start to target the younger ones, but not exclusively. As the space battle begins, we flick back and forth at Centauri Prime with some nice establishing shots, and discover that Veer has finally got what he told Mr. Morden he wanted, Mr. Morden's head on a pike, which he duly waves at, as he said he would. In space, Lita is trying to make contact with the Vorlons telepathically as their planet killer prepares to fire, but with no joy. Conventional options exhausted, Lanier asks Sheridan if he wants him to bring in the first ones. He and Delenn had hoped to keep them in reserve, but Sheridan won't stand by and watch the planet be destroyed for being in the wrong place at the wrong time. And in they come, including the race we saw earlier and the walkers from Sigma 957. The focus fire on the planet killer from above and eliminates it, causing an explosion that is seen fleet-wide before they then join the general melee. On Centauri Prime, Londo has broadcast his evidence about eliminating shadow influence to the Vorlons, but as their planet killer eclipses the sun, Veer realises there's one more thing the shadows touched on the planet that remains: Londo. And he sent them the message. They know he's there. As realisation dawns, he is dismayed and demands that Veer kill him and tell them he's done it. Sheridan asks Lanier again if there's any word from the first ones, but all he can detect is the Vorlons calling in all their remaining ships, which fortunately for Centauri Prime ends the eclipse, as even the planet killer is pulled in to help with the shadows. Sun and Smiles return to Londo and Veer. Their planet has been saved after all, but only by the narrowest of margins. Lorien arrives on the bridge of the White Star just in time, as Lita's eyes finally glow white and she encases Sheridan in an energy field, and then intones, "And you they have left for us with black eyes," similarly encasing Delenn in an energy field on behalf of the Shadows. Lorien holds Lanier back, telling him this is exactly what Sheridan hoped they could be provoked into, and they cannot be interfered with. They are elsewhere, and this is their one chance. He wanted them all to understand what was at stake, what they might be asked to die for. And so he moves behind them both and focuses hard, as the others on the bridge appear distracted, and Lanier says he can see them. Sheridan demands the Vorlons show themselves, and they appear as a veiled Centauri seer, encased in ice with a collar with a jewel serving as the mouthpiece. The Vorlons are puzzled as to why Sheridan's forces are resisting when they're trying to help, to which Sheridan responds they don't like being used. He says that a Vorlon once said understanding is a three-edged sword, and he says he now understands, which is what worries them. He's understood ever since seeing their planet killer, which logically could take out Zahadum, so why haven't they? Silence from the Vorlons. That question they don't want to answer. Ivanova, Franklin, Lanier. The Shadows take on many familiar faces as they argue with Delenn for their ideology of chaos and war breeding strength. Sheridan faces down the Vorlons, saying they're killing the message by not taking down Zahadum, not the messenger. Delenn makes the point that if the Shadows wipe out the Vorlons, they'll never know the Shadows were right. So the cycle continues. Marcus is replaced with Delenn herself as Sheridan and Delenn push to their conclusion that both sides want the younger races to take sides, but only from order or chaos options they offer. What if the younger races decide not to make a choice, to simply walk away from the game? At this point, a stray rock impacts the White Star, and Lorien's hand enters the energy field, leading to the Shadows and Vorlons realizing he's let the entire fleet see their conversations. He pulls Sheridan and Delenn out as the Shadow Planet Killer cloud envelops the younger one's ships, lowering their temperatures and shutting down their hyperspace engines, effectively trapping them. But Lorien says the first ones aren't finished with them yet, as temperatures continue to drop towards minimum survivable thresholds, and a Kosh encounter suit and a shadow image appear on the bridge to give Sheridan and Delenn a final choice to choose. Lorien says he can do no more, and their next words will determine how this resolves. So Sheridan turns their questions on them, asking them who they are and what they want. They have no answer. Delenn responds for them, saying they've been fighting each other so long they have forgotten what their role was in bringing up the younger races in the first place. The Shadow Avatar accuses them of not speaking for the others and says they will not be followed if they are dead. But as a Shadow missile launches, a Drazi ship takes the hit for the White Star, then a Minbari cruiser. These final acts of sacrifice demonstrate that in fact Delenn and Sheridan do speak for the younger races, who have now chosen another way, their own way. They will choose their own way between chaos and order, because that's the decision they've made for themselves, and it's time for the Shadows and Vorlons to get out of the galaxy and leave them to make their own mistakes. The Shadows, using Morden's voice, rather pitifully ask if Lorien will come with them, and he says he will, to see all those they left behind so long ago, and so the Vorlons and Shadows will not be alone. He explains that whilst, like them, he finds it hard to leave, as he did with the Vorlons and the Shadows, there comes a point when the teacher has to step aside and let the next generation stand on their own. That's why he wanted all the other first ones with them. None of them will stay behind this time. He finally transforms to his energy form and says that if their races survive, and when they are ready, they will see them again beyond the rim. They will wait for them there. All of the older races' ships pull out. Londo and Veer contemplate the end of the Great War. Neither can quite wrap their heads around it. Veer will head back to Babylon 5, whilst Londo, after a touch of tidying up, will do the same thing, as things are a little warm after the freeing of Narn. The two embrace warmly before Veer leaves. As Sheridan and Delenn arrive back at the station with the other White Stars, they too contemplate the end of the war and what Sheridan announces to be the Third Age. They have moved from being primitives to being under the thumbs of their first one parents to standing on their own. Now they make their own magic and stop being afraid of shadows. It may be something to do with the day I had when I was writing this, but I can't quite get excited about this episode. I feel stupid just writing that because the Londo Morden interaction in this episode was just excellent. I think what it is that we're just 6 episodes into season 4 and the Great War is over. Boom, done. You'll recall I did a video explaining why this was the case in the circumstances, but I just sneaked a peek at Reddit and apparently there are people who stopped their rewatches at this point. But do remember, this is the story of the last of the Babylon stations, not the story of the Great War. So loads more to come, it's just that this storyline resolves itself very quickly in this episode. Now, when you stop and think about the last 6 episodes, they are in no way bad, and the Jakar and Londo arc in particular is very intense. But we lose both Cartagia and Lorien pretty quickly here, which is a bit of a shame too. So I guess I'm not excited about this episode, then it's because it's sad because it's the closing of a certain chapter of the story that's been underlying much of Babylon 5's overarching plot. So from that point of view, a feeling of loss is not unreasonable, I think. So we see the entirely appropriate resolution of Mr. Morden's little arc, with him fulfilling that very early wish of Veer that he end up with his head on a pike so Veer can wave at him. We even see the flashback in this episode for those unfamiliar, which is a nice touch. It's also the first time we see him with his strings really cut, rather than being full of bravado with his shadow support crew readily to hand. You get the impression Londo might have toyed with him longer had the planet killer not been quite so close. Nice in a strange way to see he was still human underneath. Also ironic that even when he was healing, he was never that vulnerable. Sheridan's plan here is a big gamble, as he admits out loud on the White Star Bridge. You'd think they'd stand some chance with the number of ships he's pulled together, but he's basically saying, nope, we're dead, unless we can reason our way out of it. But clearly a few nukes won't be out of the question either. The guy has nuke issues. Eater's "they're pissed" comment after they go off is a nice comedy moment too. You wouldn't get Linear giving that tactical assessment. What's also nice here is that we see Thunderbolts from Babylon 5 alongside Minbari ships, which, given where we started from, is a complete turnaround. Ironically, the CGI in the series has now reached the level where I'm completely taking for granted the fact that the Thunderbolts in-cockpit displays are displaying wireframes of the Vorlon ships they're approaching that are, of course, themselves prettier wireframes. Ironic. The representations of the Vorlon as an ice queen and the shadows as ever-changing faces are cleverly done. Static order versus evolving chaos. The idea of these existential conversations being broadcast out to the fleet is also very clever, because it gives the younger races at a stroke an insight they've not had to this point about the why of the wars. And that allows Sheridan and Delenn to make the case that the younger races are simply refusing to fight as the proxies for the first ones anymore, because in a sense, as much as they'd lost their way in guiding the younger races, they have nevertheless brought them to a point where they can step away from their handlers and choose to stop the lesson, not just for 1,000 years, but forever. So now they're responsible for their own futures, with the Giants having left the playground. One thing here that I didn't in a sense see was why the Vorlons would appear as their encounter suit version, and the Kosh version at that. I would have gone for the Being of Light rendering. I think it was also a little odd having Morden's voice for the shadows. It rather took me out of the moment this time round. Not sure what the alternative might have been, admittedly, because they don't normally speak in a way that we can understand them. Interested to hear your thoughts on that. So, as the first ones finally retire, where does that leave us? The Third Age. Not just of mankind, but of all the sentients in the galaxy at that point. What does that mean for our characters? It means that what happens from this point on is essentially theirs to dictate. No one else to blame it on. Yet Morden mentions that the Shadows had allies. This might be true of the Vorlons as well, although arguably the Minbari have been in that role all along. We don't know what this means for the territories of the first ones, or whether others might try and take their place. And of course Earth is still out there and not on good terms with the station. At no point has it offered forces to the combined fleet. So that arc remains unresolved to this point. We're not even a third of the way into this season, so let's see what else JMS has up his sleeve when I come back next time. Cheers for now.